So we are starting a new lecture on web intelligence. In this lecture, I will have several different parts. The first part of this lecture is going to be on variables and functions. And then the second part is going to be on building multiple data providers. Maybe I'll do another part on drilling, which may be a very small part. But this part of the lecture is going to be building variables and functions. So let me start with building a very basic query. I have the year, state, city, and sales revenue from eFashion Universe, and I'm going to run this query. So when I run this query, this is the data that I have. And let's say, for whatever reason, one of the requirements that I have is that I don't want the state and city to be in two separate columns. I would much rather show the state and city as city, comma, space, and state name. Okay, city name, comma, space, and state name. Do I have any of the objects available in the universe that does what I'm looking for? Actually, I have the state name separate, city name separate. There is nothing that kind of joins them together. It's similar to having the last name of an employee and a first name of an employee, and you need the last name, comma, space, first name in one column, right? So that object doesn't exist. So as a report developer, what are your options? Your first option is you can ask your universe designer, whoever designed this universe, to add an object in the universe which does what you're looking for. It has the city name, comma, space, and the state name created as an object so that you can drag that object over into the report and run the report. So that's your option number one. So when you are building your universes for homework or for assignments, you can try doing this. The second option is, well, if the universe designer doesn't do it, or you don't care about opening a ticket for the universe designer and you would rather do it yourself, what you can do is you can, in web intelligence, you can build a variable that does exactly that. So here I'm going to show you how to do it in web intelligence as a variable. So if you have to build a variable, you need to be in the data access tab. In the data access tab, there is this option called new variable. So I'm going to create a new variable. And one of the best practices that I've always used is whenever you name the variable, I started with v underscore. You don't necessarily have to. I have this habit, so I'm going to create it as city state. And then it asks for whether it's a dimension or a measure. I will leave it at the default because it's going to be a dimension. And then I have a bunch of functions available that I can use. This is a formula editor, so I can basically build a pretty nice looking formula. I can also do an if-else kind of a statement here as well. So all of these functions are available. You can click on a function and then it gives you the description and the format of the function. For now, what I'm trying to build, I probably won't have to use a function. I'm just going to play with very basic things. So one important thing you need to remember about this formula editor is that this formula editor is written in Java. And I don't expect anyone to know Java. The only thing I want you to know, the only two things I want you to know are, number one, in Java, strings are enclosed in double quotes. And what is a string? A string is something which is alphanumeric. So anything which is alphanumeric is a string. If you write a sentence, that is a string. If you write a word, that is a string. If you say that my password is 1234 XYZ, that is a string because it's alphanumeric. Okay, so anything alphanumeric is a string, and a string is enclosed in double quotes in Java. So that's number one rule for building variables that I want you to remember. The other rule that I want you to remember is that strings are concatenated together using a plus sign. Okay, so strings are concatenated together using a plus sign. So these are the only two things that I want you to remember. Okay, so what are we doing here? We are combining the state with the city name, and we are putting a comma and space in between. Okay, so you start the formula with an equal to. You need the state, so double click on the state, it shows up there. So you have the state. Now what do I have to do? I need to join the state with a comma in space first, right? So would you guys agree that comma and space is a string, and should I enclose a string in double quotes? Remember the rule number 1? Yes, so comma and space is a string. I need to enclose them in double quotes. And then state is a string as well. How do we combine the two strings? We combine the two strings using a plus sign. So state plus double quotes, comma, and a space, double quotes. Until this part, all I've done is I've combined state with a comma and space. Now, following this is going to be the city name, which needs to be concatenated with this. So concatenation happens with a plus sign, and then I'm going to put the city there. So anything that comes from the object itself, you don't have to enclose them in double quotes. Web Intelligence is smart enough to know that this is a string. Okay. So if I create this variable and validate this and say OK, this variable becomes available just like any of these objects that you have, and then you can drag it to the report just like any of the objects that you have. And then I can expand this, and it gives me the state name, comma, space, the city name. So now that I have this, I don't need these columns. And then the header of the table doesn't look that nice, so I'm going to rather call it city. So you can double click here, and then you can basically either type here or type in this cell. It's the same thing, so I'm just gonna call it city. So now I have the year, the city, and the sales revenue. So this is a very simple example of variables, creating a variable in Web Intelligence. Okay, your homework now is, I think in the motor universe you have the customer first name and last name. Your homework is to concatenate the first name and last name similarly. If you want it to be more challenging, then combine the first name, last name, and middle name. And there, if somebody doesn't have a middle name, you may even want to use a if-else condition. If there's no middle name, then ignore that part or something, right? So that is your homework. I'm going to show you one more example in Web Intelligence about variables and functions. This example uses one of the predefined functions. And then again, you can practice on this part as well. So I'm going to edit the same query. And in this query, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the state column here for building a condition. And the condition that I'm going to build is going to use a prompt. And then I'll change the prompt text to something smaller. I'll say enter state. And then I'll keep everything else default, and then I'm going to run the query. So when, of course, we have seen it before, when you have a prompt, when you run it, and you select something, then it allows you to run the report, and it gives you the sales revenue for California. Okay, so now that we have done this, what I want, by default, this title cell here shows the report name, and since the report name is report 1, it shows report 1. So I don't want the report name here. I actually want this cell to say sales revenue for whatever state that I ran it for. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. So the requirement is that this cell should say sales revenue for California. So how do I do this? I can basically either click here and start typing here. If I do that, it's all in the formula line. I won't have a variable. The advantage of a variable is that I can use that variable anywhere I want to. So I would much rather create a new variable, and I'll call it v underscore title. And in this, I'll just say sales so I'll hard code sales revenue for California as a string. Since it's a string, it is enclosed in double quotes. Validate it, and then say OK. So I created a variable, and now all I have to do is to drag this variable to this cell, and now it says sales revenue for California. Okay, so far so good, pretty straightforward. It's actually not that straightforward, you will see. So everything looks good now until I refresh the report, and when I refresh the report this time around, I'm gonna pick something else. And when I pick something else, the data reflects Florida, but the title is hard-coded, and it still says California. So that's the problem, right? I have to make this title pick up the value that the user selects at the time of running the query, because this query is built on prompts. So you get the problem, right? So I need this to say sales revenue for Florida if Florida is picked. I need this to say sales revenue for DC if DC is picked when the query is ran. So how do we do that? So of course, this v underscore title needs to be modified. It is hard-coded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the state name from here, because the first part, this part is static. No matter which state I'm running it for, this part remains the same. So now I need to concatenate this with something that gives me the name of the state from the prompt. So there is a function called user response. But before I explain you user response, I'm going to explain you a couple of easy functions. So there is a function called mod, for example, or there is a function called, let me start with something that is even easier. So there is a function called absolute value, or ABS. So this function name is ABS. Within parentheses is the parameter that it takes. So the parameter that it takes is a number, and it returns a number. Okay, so that's how you read it. This is the return type. This is the parameter that it takes. So now let's go to user response. Function name is user response. Return type is a string. Within parentheses are the different parameters. The first parameter is the data provider, which is in square brackets, which means it's an optional parameter. The third parameter is an index, which is an optional parameter as well. If you click on this, you get more information about this function. It takes you to the documentation and then gives you a lot more information. But anyways, so I'm not going to worry about the optional parameters. I'm only going to worry about the prompt string. And prompt string is the text that I typed in when I created the prompt. So the best way to get the get any function up there is by double clicking. So I get the user response function. I'm not going to worry about the first and third. These are optional parameters. I'm only going to worry about prompt string, which is, if you remember, it was enter state colon, and I can show you once it runs as well. But this was a prompt string that I selected. Since it's a string, it goes in double quotes. Validate it, say OK. Now it shows you Florida. So I'm going to edit the query and show you what I'm talking about. So this is the prompt string that I was talking about. It has, if E is capital and S is capital and there's a colon here, it has to exactly match for it to work. Okay, so now I run it again. I select DC this time, say OK, and then you can see that the data is updated and the prompt or the title is updated as well.